Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the 13th strategic webinar in the EUROCONTRol Stakeholder Forum, where we look at key issues affecting our industry as we build back better. I'm Philip Hughes, Head of Stakeholder Management at EUROCONTRol, and today we'll explore the following major question. Is pan-European air navigation services is that model still fit for purpose? So as we approach the 50th anniversary of the Central Route Charges Office, this is a timely opportunity to have a discussion, to have a closer look at how the current air navigation services charges model, which is essential to funding European air traffic management, could evolve in the future. So during today's discussion, we'll be assessing the following leading questions. Does the existing air navigation services charges model still offer a reliable, fair and transparent funding of ATM infrastructure and services to ensure uninterrupted and safe air transport? Can the current model really support the optimal use of scarce resources? Should the current air navigation services model evolve to support sustainability and environmental targets? And is there a need to build a financial buffer to be utilised in times of crisis, a bit like the COVID crisis, which we have just gone through? So for this topical conversation, we've lined up some top aviation players who will help us build a clearer picture of what is at stake for the different industry sectors and to help to drive the conversation forward. So first of all, we have Florian Guimard, who's the CEO of the French ANSP DSNA, a role which he took up last July. Before that, Florian was the Executive Director of the CESAR Joint Undertaking, Executive Director since 2014. Florian is a proven leader driving the modernisation of European ATM through the SJU right from the very start, joining the SJU as Chief Programme Officer in 2008. And after 5 years as head of ops and of ops development here at Eurocontrol, he played a key role in the setup and running of CESAR 1. Rory Sergeson is the head of ATM Infrastructure Europe for IATA. Rory has over 20 years airline operational experience with Aer Lingus before joining IATA in late 2016. Rory has held various senior management posts with responsibility for air traffic services and compliance management. His responsibilities in IATA are centred on leading infrastructure activities in the European region with a focus on single European sky. Rory leads all aspects on performance and charging scheme and development of IATA's strategy and policies in close cooperation with member airlines. And he's a close working relationship with airline members, the network manager, EU, state CAAs and ANSPs within Europe. And then Dr. Jarlath Malloy is a Senior Environmental Affairs Manager with UK air navigation service provider NATS, where he focuses on climate policy, mitigation and adaptation. He's also an advisor to the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and has worked in public and private and non-profit sectors as a chartered physicist. So before we enter the discussion, just some housekeeping rules. You can participate and shape the discussion, you the stakeholders, by submitting questions using the Q&A function. If you encounter any technical issue or for any other general remark, you can use the chat function. And to help us set the scene for the discussion now, and before giving the floor to our guests, I'd like to show you a short video to set the scene. Okay, so I think that video sets the scene just in terms of some of the issues we have. So at this stage, what I'll do is I'll give the floor to Florian just to set the scene from the ANSP side. Florian, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. Philippe, can you hear me?
And loud and clear.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be here to this session this afternoon. So just maybe before I start to dig into the question, two quick forwards from my side, just to highlight the fact that the charging regime and any change to the charging regime, of course, is in the hands of the legislator and the regulator, not in the hand of the ANSP. So I here just represent, I would say, the view of the French ANSP as a user of the system, but it is clear that it is not our purpose, our role to, I would say, make any strong statement regarding the evolution of the charging regime. The second element I wanted to highlight is that, of course, we are fully aware of the situation that the current crisis is generating for all aviation stakeholders, and what it means in particular from a financial standpoint for the airspace users, and what it means in concrete terms as well in relation to the ongoing status for RP3. This being said, just to go now into the question whether the charging regime is fit for purpose or not anymore. I mean, the question to me has to be looked at from an historical standpoint. And if I look back to the history of the charging model for air navigation service, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that it's been useful, it's been helpful to support financially the system over years and years. And to a large extent, it has been able to cope with the continuous increase of traffic over the last 40 to 50 years. And this is already something, because we know that the current situation is very tough, it's very delicate, but to a large extent, the current model has served its purpose. The second element I wanted to highlight as well is that by, of course, serving its purpose and therefore being able to finance the air navigation services, it has also demonstrated that the cost to a large extent have been continuously reduced through this period. It is largely due to the fact that we have increased the traffic while keeping the cost under control. But if you look at the overall reduction, it is nevertheless quite significant. To a large extent, the current model has pushed towards cost control and a cost reduction. The other element I wanted to highlight is that to a certain extent, this model is reliable. It is a model which is understood, which is balanced. It is balanced by the fact that the amount have been returned to the users in the recent years, according to the traffic increase and the decrease of the cost. It is transparent as well and understood, which is quite an important element. I think there would be nothing worse than a system which is not perceived, even if it's just a perception, which is not perceived as being transparent, which is not perceived as being understood by all the different users, and in particular by the airlines. I think this is a very, very strong point to the current model. Now, this being said, we are hit by an unprecedented crisis, and we all know that this model has never been designed for such a crisis. To a large extent, this charging regime is fit for some kind of variation up and down of the traffic, but not to the proportion of what we faced during the COVID crisis. So to a large extent, we should not judge whether it remains fit for purpose or not according to this crisis. We are in something which is very special. If I have to make an ATM analogy, we are not in a kind of typical storm with bad weather. We are more in the order of magnitude of what a volcanic ash crisis will be for the regime. And during this specific period, we have to take some specific response. And this is a response that was agreed and defined by the states with the regulation 1627, which actually is the answer to the COVID situation as a way to keep the system sustainable from a financial standpoint. What I have to say is that saying that is not to say that we cannot change things. I think there are nevertheless things that should be improved. If we look at a number of indicators that we are using in the context of the performance regulations, there are definitely some indicators that we should better consider in relation to the environment. For instance, how do we make sure that the big sustainability efforts and the entire aviation community is taking right now is something that is properly supported by the charging regulation. To a large extent, we have already some instruments that could be used at some point. Maybe we'll come back to that, like the modulation of the charges. But we know as well that there are some effects in relation to the different unit rates which are applicable in Europe, which will, by the way, increase through the what we see coming in RP3, which might create some unexpected behavior, some behaviors that we do not want to see from an environmental standpoint. I think that this kind of evolution, this is really something on which we need to focus our attention, on which we need to focus our energy. To a large extent, this is a topic for discussion in the context of the future reference period preparation, where we could actually work maybe on new indicators, or maybe as well on creating more incentives through the existing charging regime without necessarily changing it, but creating more incentive for efficiency, for capacity. I keep in mind that France, as the French airspace has generated this summer a big proportion of the en route delays. How are we incentivized from a regulatory standpoint, from a financial standpoint to cope with this situation? This is something which is at stake. Just to conclude with this short intervention, as you understand, my word is to say that we have a model. It has been working for quite a long time. It has been evolving, but I think we should be careful about throwing it because of this crisis. We are in a situation where we do have to deal with this specific crisis, which does require some specific measures. But on the other hand, improving the system is something that we can and we need to consider most likely for the upcoming period. And here I'm really talking about preparing RP4, for instance. I'm as well talking about making sure that whatever evolution we foresee from that standpoint, we keep the model balanced, we keep it transparent. As we have seen in the current RP3 negotiations, this is really something of a strong value to be able to explain how the system evolves, and we should be careful of not changing it only because of this crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauriane. That was very interesting. So at this stage, I'll hand over to Rory for the IATA viewpoint. Rory.
Good afternoon, Philippe. Good afternoon, fellow panelists. Good afternoon, everybody watching online. Thank you for the opportunity here this afternoon to discuss what is perhaps one of the most major topics that airlines will face in the coming years. I think, it must be clear from the very start that in terms of the airlines and our position, in 2021, airlines in Europe are projected to lose between 40 and 52 billion after a global loss of 138 billion in 2020. It is clear from our perspective that the current system was built on the basis of sustained growth, and it is also clear that the system is currently not fit for purpose, a fact acknowledged by DG Move in 2020. And subsequently in their actions to develop emergency measures to reset the RP3 economic framework. Despite this, unfortunately, latest projections show an average 36% increase in en route charges is on the way for airspace users in 2022. Airlines should not be held accountable for the historic drop in traffic and the subsequent drop in air navigation services revenues due to the state's actions to deal with the pandemic, such as closing their borders, implementing travel bans or restrictions. At this present moment, airlines are expected to not only cover their own losses, but also the so-called revenue gap of billions of euros from 2023 for our air navigation service providers. Put simply, how do you expect airlines to be able to sustain this system? no business could survive at 99% of their costs and 50% of their revenue, depending upon its customers to cover the cost through increased prices. But this is what we see, unfortunately, from monopoly ANSPs. While the airspace community does fully appreciate the support of the member states to defer payments in 2020, this measure alone was insufficient. It did not create a financial environment allowing airspace users to sustain air navigation services revenue gap, as you said in your introduction, of 8.6 billion euros from 2023 and beyond. We do acknowledge that governments worldwide have provided support, over $243 billion, in fact, 81 billion of which was in assistance of payments and furlough schemes. However, 55% of this is in the form of loans or in the form of equity relief, all of which needs to be paid back, which severely increases the airline debt model into the future, which we now estimate to be around $650 billion on the basis of the pandemic to date. We also note that of those deferred payments, nearly 100% has been paid back again now by the airspace users, which shows that airspace users are willing to pay for their services used. But the crux of the matter here is we cannot continue to pay for the mere availability of the service. For airlines to carry significant liability in their budgets over the next years to pay back survival loans, significant fees to state entities, may well drive more into bankruptcy. And if this occurs, what would happen to the service providers? I think this is a question we will have to discuss in the course of this particular session today. Touching upon what Florian has said, the European network traffic was down on average 58% in 2020 compared to 2019. Unfortunately, having reviewed the recently published PRB monitoring report for 2020, ANSPs have not reacted to this significant reduction in traffic. The data submitted for states for 2020 shows that they have reduced their costs by an average only 4% compared to 2019. Airlines have taken extremely painful decisions and managed to cut their costs by 35%. Some states were able to reduce their costs by up to 20%. We must acknowledge this. However, 6 states actually increased their costs in 2020, which is very difficult for the airspace users to understand, considering the lack of traffic and the lack of required resources to control an almost 60% reduction. The monitoring data also shows that air navigation services providers manage the gap in their revenues in very different ways, using either their own resources, for the most part, loans, or injections of equity by their owners. I also note that the PRB have stated that given the dire financial situation of most of the airspace users approaching 2022, air navigation service providers should contribute to the recovery of European aviation by adapting their costs in their revised performance plans. However, in the course of this summer, having led the RP3 replanning process, it has to be said that the majority of states have not taken this part up. It is urgent that they take decisive steps to adapt the range and scope of their services operated and offered by individual ANSPs to the actual demand that's there. European states could and should cover losses for their own state entities. Direct funding from governments to cover their shortfall will give governments a strong incentive to extract value for their taxpayers' money. It would present them with a unique opportunity to leverage improvements to air traffic control provision while contributing in a meaningful way to reducing delays and, most importantly, the impact upon the environment. This short-term funding from states, however, is not a solution in the long-term structural problems facing air navigation services in Europe. The present crisis is an opportunity to liberalize the system and to consider new market funding models that are working well in other parts of the world. The immediate requirement is survival of the industry. We note that on average, air navigation service providers have earned an EBITDA of 24.6% since 2015. This is simply unacceptable for monopoly service providers whose customers pre-COVID averaged between 4 and 6%. Clearly, there is significant surplus on hand for ANSPs to cover their own losses. Having led the difficult consultation process for replanning of RP3 during the summer months, I can say that it is clear the majority of states support their own service providers rather than the airspace users. Of the 29 states, we estimate only 6 have developed plans and submitted ones on the 1st of October that will achieve the European and local cost efficiency targets. It is clear that airlines cannot continue to bear the effects of a regulation that facilitates member states watering down the ambitions of the SES, their targets, and while facilitating monopoly service providers to continually underachieve. Without significant reform of the performance and charging scheme, how can airlines be expected to support European economic recovery while significantly burdened by high cost and continued under-delivery of the fully financed services? The effects of the pandemic will be felt by airlines for many years to come. States did not support reform of the traffic risk sharing mechanisms, which will allow states to recover €8.6 billion of flights that could never have taken place due to border closures and travel restrictions, although they had the opportunity to do so in 2020. Equally, the requirements laid down by the European Green Deal will significantly burden airlines with the requirements for SAF and for sustainability. But without the structural reform of the actual state level infrastructure providers, delivery of results are significantly outside the control of airlines. Strong economic regulation is needed by means, for example, of a genuine price cap scheme is something that we could discuss, and by monitoring the charges determination process for the unit rates of air navigation charges according to the objectives of the performance scheme. Such regulation shall also consider the situation of each ANSP and their level of efforts made to engage in the structural reforms and investments requested to deliver the ultimate SES benefits. A robust airspace users consultation mechanism must be also implemented. So to sum up, failing to deliver performance targets must result in some meaningful penalties. Where network, national or local capacity targets are not met, service providers shall be subject to some predefined financial direct penalties, which are correlated to those missed performances. Vigilance required to guard against the potential for cost associated with any penalties to be included in standard charges should also be looked at. But let's make it clear that even with 58% of the traffic last year, we barely made the capacity targets and we barely made the environmental targets. So something is significantly wrong within the system, and we need to look at a reform, perhaps, as you say, Florian, an RP2 or RP4, should I say, at this point. But equally, we have a bigger prize on the table, and that's the reform of the overall SES regulation. We are concerned by the state's conservative approach, and we are emboldened by the parliamentary position, which is more in line with the European Commission's proposals in the first instance. We understand that this is setting the framework for the future of aviation in Europe, and it's a battle that must be taken, and it's a battle that must be won. So I'll hand back to you now, Philip, and apologies if I took a little bit more time than expected.
All right, thanks, Rory. Charlotte, last but not least, give us your views in terms of, particularly from the environmental point of view, yeah.
Thanks, Philip. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me along today. There of course are two crises, and we've heard Rory talk passionately about the financial one. I'll talk about the other one that we've seen and heard a lot about over the last 18 months, and that is, of course, is the environment one. And many of you might be wondering, what has the environment got to do with route charging? Well, the short answer is around 3 million tons of CO2. The longer answer is that anyone connected to route charging is joining a growing list of professions, unexpectedly perhaps, on the front lines of climate change mitigation, including insurers, risk managers, accountants, and even investors. Sorry, I think I've gone ahead. Many of us are so busy with our day jobs that we don't have time to digest the scale of the climate challenge. It's almost overwhelming sometimes. It's hard to read the IPCC report and not feel a little bit numb. We've deadlines to meet and things to do, and we think climate change is for our environment or our comms teams to solve. It's not. it's yours and it's mine to help solve together. Last March, Frans Timmermans, Vice President of the Commission, spoke of our children facing a future of fighting wars for water and food. And last Thursday, the UN Secretary General was talking about us when he called out the aviation industry's commitments as being consistent with climate change of 3 degrees, and he called for credible emission targets. 30 years ago, aviation was around 500 million tons of CO2. Coincidentally, about the same time, actually, as the UNFCCC treaty was signed in Rio. Pre-COVID, this had doubled to 1,000 million tons, or nearly 3% of the total globally. Aviation CO2 could be 30% of that total in 2050, while every other sector is planning to decarbonize, and that in itself deserves a discussion. It will take decades to decarbonize the industry, and the latest IPCC report makes clear we really don't have that kind of time. Today, I'll focus on just one idea to reduce aviation CO2 without any technical barriers, safety concerns, or retraining. Admittedly, anything on route charges or flight planning is unlikely to be popular, so these are my own views. But this option could save or reduce CO2 emissions in Europe by 1.5%. So we shouldn't just ignore it. Every ANSP or state, as we've heard from Rory and Florian, set the route charges to cover the costs of providing air traffic control. You sometimes see this actually in your airfare. The rate is agreed with national regulators in consultation with the airlines to reflect the costs of providing that service. And these costs vary for many reasons. And as a result, as you can see on the slide, the rate varies across Europe from a little under 20 euro to nearly 100 euro. The cost of for each flight is usually the unit rate times the aircraft weight times the distance. And today, it's actually cheaper overall to fly around some countries with higher route charges, even if it burns more fuel, as the total cost of the route charge is greater than the total cost of the extra fuel. The current rules incentivize flying through the cheapest airspace, not the shortest or the lowest CO2. 50 years ago, of course, policymakers had very different challenges, but their legacy doesn't have to be ours. There are different ways you can solve this, and I'll just summarize one. I suggest the route charge office have two systems, a headline unit rate, which airlines pay, and a second back office set of unit rates, which correspond to the ANSP's costs. I'm not suggesting a single or a harmonized rate. I propose that the headline rate is what's presented to airlines to eliminate the perverse incentive, which rewards them for flying the lowest cost route rather than the lowest CO2 route. The current system for states and ANSPs to settle the route charges would remain, and this would form the back office set of rates. The role of the route charge office then would evolve, and they would operate a revenue sharing arrangement to cover both the ANSP's costs and the transition costs to adapt to the new approach. Yes, of course, there's going to be problems and challenges will arise, and they'll need to be solved. But these also bring opportunities. To balance airspace capacity and demand, regulators should flip from measuring departure time performance to arrival time performance. And this would also eliminate additional perverse incentives, which increase CO2. So for example, less queuing prior to takeoff on the taxiway or going around in circles before landing. Instead, you spent a few extra minutes in a terminal cafe without burning tons of unnecessary fuel. Ultimately, you arrive at the same time, and you can be more confident of that. We could also try balance capacity and demand with differential charging. European regulators have an opportunity to prompt the industry to take a tangible and small step towards reducing its CO2. Making these changes now minimize the disruption as traffic picks back up. Yes, of course, change is disruptive, but ask yourself, is it really credible to sit around for another 20 years for fuel and fleet changes to reduce aviation CO2? I'll be the first to say it's not a perfect idea and there will be unintended consequences. But what we have now is worse. We can't afford to let perfect be the enemy of good. Every ton counts. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we covered a lot of very interesting ground there. So let me just try and let's deal with it in a couple of chunks. Let's talk about for instance, the current problem in relation to the hole that's already there, the 8.6 billion, which is there in revenue, and how we deal with that in the near term. I might ask each of you what your view on that is and how we should address it. Florian, what do you think from an ANSP point of view?
Well, I think addressing this topic has already been, to a large extent, debated and settled by the states. I can understand that it has been settled in a way which is not the way that the airspace users wanted. That's clear. It has been settled in a way which allows this gap of financing to be recovered in the upcoming period. And therefore, it will require extra financial effort from the airspace users in the years to come during the RP3 period. And that's the outcome of all the process that had been tackled again between the European Commission and the member states of the last period. This is the outcome that we have today. And I can fully understand Rory when he's saying that this is not enough, that this is not sufficient, that this is not good for the airspace users, and that the states have decided to support their air navigation service provider instead of supporting their airlines. I mean, I leave that to him as a statement. I mean, all what I see is that today we have a way forward in terms of financing the system. Is it something which is sustainable in the long run? I think it really depends upon the traffic forecast and how the recovery will take place. We received the STAT4 forecast just a few days ago. It seems to go in the direction which was to a certain extent anticipated by the states to say, okay, this is a gap that we have to fill over a kind of 5-year period. And from that standpoint, the RP3 will allow us to recover. It's not going to take longer. If it would have been the case, then maybe other choices would have been made. And to a certain extent, I must admit, to my surprise as well, to a certain extent, the STAT4 forecast goes into this direction. We do see the recovery picking up maybe faster than some have anticipated. And to a certain extent, this means that the current model does remain sustainable with the fix that was decided by the states. So I think at this point in time, this is about what we can say. Is it a satisfactory situation for all parties? I leave it to Rory to say something about it. Obviously, it's not my role to say that. What I think is relevant is that we should commit to make it work and to make it work better than what we've been doing in the past, to make sure that this money is properly used, to modernize the system, to make investment that, by the way, we should probably have made for years in this domain. And to make sure that we go faster, because this will be a guarantee that we can have lower costs, lower prices in the future.
So, Rory, I suppose that leads into the sustainability discussion. I mean, you alluded to it in your introduction in terms of if the current situation stays as it is, how's that going to impact? And what do you think, based on the STAT4 numbers? I mean, you're looking at 2023 for back to 2019 levels based on the current forecast, but a lot of that's domestic traffic, so it's going to be, you won't have as many high-level overflights as part of it, so the mix is going to change. What's IATA's view on that?
You know, I think for sure we've only received the data, so we need to understand, have a good look at it, and have our own economics department look at the numbers versus what we are projecting similarly for passenger growth, etc., over the coming years. So I'll reserve my statement on that for the moment. But what I would say is, yes, it looks like you know, the hopeful recovery is progressing. But I think, you know, we also need to understand what the state interventions will be as we move forward, because at the moment we still have a very fragmented situation with, you know, COVID pass, no COVID pass, you know, entry exits into each of the states, and that will also drive the situation when it comes to travel. Equally, we see, you know, inflation beginning to grow everywhere. The national economy is beginning to draw back a little bit. So, you know, that's also going to be a significant issue because, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs, unfortunately, due to the pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of people have much more, have much less, should I say, disposable income right now, and as we know, that also drives economic performance and economic decisions when it comes to travel. So it's going to be a challenge. You know, in terms of the 8.6 billion, I think for sure we had lobbied for a different model to be put in place to try and take care of that so-called revenue gap, if we want to call it that. Equally, you know, it's the states to play the role in not going that direction. So while Florian is saying, you know, it should be used to ensure that services are provided, etc., but those services to date have yet to achieve any of the single European sky goals. We have not hit a capacity target ever in the performance scheme. And the environmental targets, to bring Jarlath in, you know, we need to look at different measures for that. We need to look at different key performance areas. The Kia last year was just about made by 0.2%. With a 58% reduction in traffic, there's something going on. You know, I mean, we reduced the RAD restrictions. We opened up as best we could for CCO operations, but we're still not hitting the environmental targets. And it's not all driven by cost. And, you know, I think from Jarlath's perspective, an airline doesn't make its decisions just purely based on cost. It bases its decisions on multiple deciding factors. Areas that are not included in his presentation perhaps are other aspects of European regulation that need to be taken into account by airlines, such as EU 261. Where, you know, if an airline doesn't meet its connecting flight, for example, they're then liable for the cost of all of those passengers. So, you know, to say that we just fly low-cost routes all the time, I think is not fully incumbent of the complexity of the airline decision-making process. And, you know, equally at this moment in time, airspace users have strong financial incentives to reduce gases and emissions and fuel use. And next year in 2022, we face the perfect storm, unfortunately, of huge infrastructure cost increases in both airport, air navigation service provision, and in fuel. So, you know, the decisions that airlines are making now, having invested billions in new aircraft, fleet, engines, etc., are critical. And, you know, the airlines are playing their part here. The airlines have invested in systemization, training, and millions of euros in flight planning, fuel monitoring systems, etc., to try and achieve the best outcome for their flights. However, as soon as they push back from the gate, they're in the hands of the air navigation service providers. And that's where we need the structural reform in Europe, I believe, to drive the sustainability question.
So that's a very nice intro. Over to you, Jarlath, in terms of the sustainability. Obviously, increasing fuel prices are going to drive the incentive, for instance, in terms of, you know, environmental efficiency. But is modulation of charges, do you think, the answer? I mean, from an economics point of view, do we have all the data which we need in order to construct a perfect flight? I know, for instance, trying to get fuel uplift data, for instance, in relation to particular flights is a particular issue. And is there not a danger that you might get perverse reactions in terms of how that might fly? So if I'm flying a route, for instance, and I've got bad weather and I have to deviate, or there's some other issue, how do you see that kind of modulation piece actually working?
So at NATS, we've included an option in our next business plan to work with airlines and the regulator on a feasibility study into how charging might work in the future. And as Rory said himself, route charging is incredibly complex and it's a challenge for everyone. And it needs careful study to understand the potential pros and cons of each option and each solution. But I don't think it'd be fair to me today to prejudge the outcome of that consultation with Rory and his members at this point.
Okay. In terms of the future perfect storm, which Rory mentioned, one of the issues, Florian, is a subject close to your heart, which is investment in capacity and digitization. It's all very well saying we have an 8.6 billion hole, but we also have to make, if we're going to have the technology to do the kind of sustainability, the capacity and efficiency piece, how are we going to manage that on top of the deficit? How are we going to bring capacity in? Because from discussions we've had in Eurocontrol with CTOs from ANSPs, they're all saying to me, like, our budget has been cut by 50%. We don't have the same ability anymore to spend money. So where's it going to come from, and how's that going to be managed?
Well, first of all, I think there should be a kind of general understanding that we should make the most of each and every euro that is being paid to the system by the charging systems or by the airspace users. And the part of doing that is to make sure that we keep the investment level across the European network, because this is what will prepare for the future. And this is what we are trying as well to safeguard in the SNA, and this is the proposal that has been tabled to the European Commission in the context of RP3, to make sure that we do keep the relevant level of investment. And by the way, RP3 is putting more scrutiny on the investments that are being made by providers, which is probably a good thing. This shows as well that without touching the charging model, we can do more with it. What I mean by that is that the problem of those investments is the way they are coordinated between providers and the type of priority and the type of decisions that are being made. And for that, we do not need or require a change to the regulation or to the charging regime. We do need the proper level of coordination at European level. And I do believe that this is provided by the work that is being done by the network manager, in particular by the fact that now we are building, and when I say we, it's the network manager with the ANSPs, we are building plans to synchronize investment to make sure that we do perform the prioritization exercise together. It is not yet to the full, I would say, speed and cruise level, but it is already an improvement. And by doing that, we can ensure that those investments are coherent, that they are compliant as well with the targets that we set at European level, and that they are going to be part of the answer to a more performing system in the future, including from an environmental standpoint. And I think that there as well, I've talked about investment, I'd like to talk about operations. I think it is Rory who mentioned the RAD restrictions. This is something on which we can act at European level, where I do believe that the network manager can have a stronger view on how we use the RAD and what kind of right balance should we strike between capacity and environmental benefits through the management of the network. I believe this is something that can only be managed at a European level. It would not make sense even for the French airspace or the UK airspace, which are already quite big, to optimize trajectories only at their levels. That will be only one proportion of the traffic flows, and that will be maybe detrimental to the overall optimization of the traffic. And this kind of behavior needs to be a European behavior. It can be supported by the work of the network manager, and maybe we can consider as well a better indicator in the context of RP4. I was mentioning that there's a lot of work being put together to prepare for such indicators in relation to the environmental benefits. And I think this is something on which the community needs to focus, because this is definitely the next challenge that we will all have. And regarding, again, the investments that we are making, we should be in a position to justify how we spend this money towards preparing for a good performance level towards those indicators. That's, I think, how we should act at European level.
Okay. So, Rory, can I just come back to you with some of the specific points I just want you to expand on? So some of the things that are proposed, for instance, we talked about a common unit rate. We talked about modulation of charges. And the third thing we spoke about was a financial buffer, some kind of insurance policy. So we take those three specific things. What's IATA's view on that?
Okay, so if we take the financial buffer in the first instance, you know, the 1.1 billion of user charges that was deferred, we were a little dismayed, to be honest, that only 10 states actually took up that loan. in the immediate
So are we.
aftermath for all the work, right?
All the work.
But equally, it also demonstrated that air navigation service providers have the resources and they have the surplus. Many of them, I'm not saying all, but many of them have earned a significant surplus throughout the last reference period. So,
But sorry,
to
but
put it
did
in
not a lot of them go back to their governments and to get the governments to fund them?
well, some of them did, yeah,
Yeah.
but some of them got direct equity injections.
Yeah,
But
okay.
you know, that's what every airline shareholder did for their airline. So that's what's
Yeah.
expected of a shareholder. The shareholder should step up in times of need, right? Because they've earned significant returns over the past years. As I talked about, 26.4% of EBITDA over since
Yeah.
2015. Average cost of capital of about 5.6%. And that cost of capital, for the most part, is used to pay dividends to the state. 99.8% of our air navigation service providers are government entities. You know, so that's going directly back into the state. So, you know, for the shareholder to step in, I think is only right. Do we need a buffer? I'm not sure, to be honest with you, because as you say, the complexities and the cost of maintaining, say, such a buffer would ultimately, I presume, come back to the feet of the airspace users to take, you know, as a percentage of that cost.
Or the states could organise it. The states themselves could organise some kind of buffer fund.
Yeah, I think the states have indicated how they feel about the whole situation in not backing their navigation service providers by paying the revenue gap. Although I won't tarnish every state. You know, we have 3 states that have stepped up for RP3 and will finance or partly finance the route charges in 2022 by application of Article 29.6. And those states should be the benchmark for every other state. We see varying levels of shall we say, state support through reducing the cost of capital that was, you know, originally consulted, etc. But the state needs to play a bigger role. So on that particular point, I think there needs to be more discussion. You know, there was available European rescue funds, which could have been rediverted into the states to try and ensure that their own civil servants, for the most part, are being paid again. Although we will say that many states continued with full cost throughout the whole period. You know, only 3 or 4 managed to save, you know, over about 10%. And as we know, staff cost is the most significant cost piece for an air navigation service provider. There's complexities around that, but equally it should be addressed.
Common unit rate.
The common unit rate, okay, so it depends on what common unit rate that we have, right? So if we were to set a common unit rate based on 2021 figures at €50, 22 of the air navigation service providers of Europe would increase their costs and would increase their charge for no additional benefit. So, you know, we don't see...
But I think the proposal is that you create a pool of costs where you have a headline number and the back office divvies it out depending on the cost. So to the airlines, it should be, in a global sense, it should be roughly the same pot of money. But sorry, the other thing I suppose is, do you believe that the difference in unit rate actually does lead to differential behaviour in terms of avoiding certain states?
It can do, but equally, you know, we're not like electricity or phone service providers. Airplanes have to fly in certain directions. So if you want to operate into a particular aerodrome, you want to operate into a particular hub, you must pass through that airspace. You know, don't forget in early 2020, the reference period changed how we were charged for our flights, you know, so now we're being charged on the route flown, not the route planned. And, you know, let's be straight here, for all the complexity that has driven between M2, M3 data, the back office increased workload for airlines in terms of invoice reconciliation, etc. The benefit is now 0.3%. So, you know, are we using, you know, is this discussion around a sledgehammer to crack a nut? Should we really be getting back into structural reform and understanding how the unit rates, etc., are developed? Well, you know, we had FABs. Why didn't the fabs work? Florian talked about, synergies and system development, etc. I mean, Jarlath is sitting there working for NATS. NATS and the IAA as the UK Ireland fab, their systems don't talk to each other. They bought different systems. One is iTech, one is Coupans, for example. So, their synergies were there, but when the low-hanging fruit from the fabs went, the real work just disappeared because it was too difficult. Ultimately, they talk about sovereignty issues, but really I think it comes down to finance, and that's a question that we have. Modulation of charges. Our members don't support modulation of charges. Linking charges to CO2 emissions would lead to more contention on how to address aviation's emissions, for example, and undermine the global multilateral long-term approach that is being developed in ICAO. So modulating charges on the basis of CO2 would be equivalent to modulating them in relation to fuel use, and would therefore, in our opinion, likely be challenged on the Chicago Conventions. So, there's aspects there that we need to have. But equally, let's be straight here. Modulation of charges, the opportunity for modulating charges has been around for the last 10 years, and not one state has chosen to modulate. Maybe in some terminal areas we've seen some modulation, but in en route, we've not seen any.
Okay. I think, though, on sustainability, I think you made the point yourself that it's an existential crisis for the aviation industry. So I don't think we are in the same place we were 2 or 3 years ago. So, Jarlath, there's a couple of questions that have come through on the WebEx Q&A for you. First of all, Eckhart Gut from European Air Transport does make the point that questioning the air navigation charges model is not related to COVID and has been valid for many years now. And I agree, except that COVID has probably thrown it into relief. There's a question here from Stephen Weidhiller in the Lufthansa Group. He's saying, what are the actual city pairs where you see it makes most sense to deviate from the most fuel efficient CO2 route? We see in overwhelming city pairs that there is no alternative flight routes to make a saving. In his view, there is a high magnitude of avoidable CO2 by detours that have to be flown because of military training capacity problems, etc. So do you have any views on that from some of the analysis you've done?
Well, Phil, there's quite a few questions packed in there. I'm not sure I'm going to get all of them answered.
Just a high level bit, yeah.
There's some fair comments, absolutely. I think if you're looking for some examples that's accessible to anyone, all you really need to do is turn on any of the ADS-B monitors on the web and look around some of the borders with the boundaries where there are differentials between route charging, and you can see what happens.
Very good. Okay, so I'm just conscious of time here. So what I would like to do now is to give each of you about a minute just to give a kind of a brief synopsis, having gone through the conversation of the key points in terms of a takeaway in the route charges. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. So Florian, why don't I give the floor to you?
Okay, well, I'll be very quick and mainly repeat what I've been saying already. Coming back to the initial question regarding whether the current charging model is still fit for purpose or not, my answer will be that it is still fit for purpose. I mean, but of course, we do have to first provide the relevant solution to the current crisis. And as you understand, this is on its way, and it is a decision from the state to do so. And secondly, it doesn't mean that we do not have to improve it. And I think there are areas of improvement that should be considered upfront. I think this is something we should definitely anticipate in terms of what are the incentives, what are the indicators we want to see in the future in RP4. I just beat myself here, but his incentive, for instance, on capacity, on delay reduction, sufficient for an ASP to act today. I'm not sure it is, and so maybe this is something that should be revised. Is it sufficient from a sustainability standpoint? Maybe it is not, and maybe this is something, again, on which we need to act. And beyond the charging model and beyond RP4, I would say that what matters as well is the European cooperation, is the European coordination, because whatever we invent in terms of charging model, at the end, we will have to rely on a certain degree of technology and certain degree of operations. And the more this technology, the more the operations will be harmonized, behaving in the same way across Europe, the more coherent cost structure we will have. And ultimately, this is what will be reflected in the charging model in one way or the other. So this means that we have to act on that. And to act on that, I believe we can do more with what we have without necessarily changing the regulation itself. We can do more with the role of the network manager. We can do more in terms of coordination and cooperation between ANSPs to align our priorities, to align our investments. And I think that's really where the commitment of the stakeholders, of the ANSPs, of the network manager together with us should be in the future to improve and avoid all sorts of craziness that we had in the past. I'm not saying that they were all crazy, but when you look at the number of technology deployments that we've had across Europe over the last 10 years, I think one could say that we could have done better probably with the investment that we've had in the past. So let's not make the same mistake twice. Let's look at the degree of investment we have ahead of us and let's make the most out of it. And one last element, I believe that to a large extent, the charging model, a big part of its value is again in its transparency. It's a rather complex system, but once you understand it is as well something which is transparent, and transparency builds trust. I think to a large extent, airspace user will disagree with the outcome of the current system in terms of how much they have to pay, but they will not disagree that the system is transparent and that they understand at least how it's being run. And this is something of a value that we have to keep in any case. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rory-Anne. Now, given the fact that Rory is at number 2-1 by ANSPs, I'll leave the last word to him. So, Charlotte, why don't you give us just a brief synopsis so we can hear from, and then Rory, okay?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Philip. So I would say to everyone watching, at your next team meeting, talk about this webinar, talk about the climate crisis with your colleagues, keep talking about it, normalize talking about climate change. Ask your boss, can you spend more time on this topic? Ask their boss why your organization isn't doing more. I believe 2050 is too far off in the distance and we need to act now. Thank you.
So Rory, last but not least, and you might touch on the sustainability issue in terms of where do you might just give me an indication about how you think aviation generally should address sustainability.
It's a pretty big question for me, Philip, I'm afraid.
You've only not too long.
Okay, I think, what's clear from our AGM last week in Boston is that, the international aviation industry is committed to being sustainable, is committed to achieving net zero by 2050. We are buying modern fleets. We are working with OEMs on new technology, SAF, hydrogen, etc. But we also need the states and those suppliers to step up and make those options a viable option. We cannot continue to carry the can for everything. I think that's clear. We invest heavily in sustainability programs and sustainability projects, and we are trying our damnedest to be as efficient and effective as possible. However, we need the infrastructure to support that. And we need the infrastructure to ensure that when we leave the gate, we are on the most optimized trajectory that we could possibly be. Our systems tell us that we are. If the air navigation service provider, without the wind, without the weather, and without the load and fuel thinks that we're not, perhaps there's something wrong in the system. And we need to discuss that at a higher level. In terms of the overall sustainability, I mean, financial sustainability of the airline system at the moment is in dire straits. I think we need to ensure that what we get is value for money, and that, lots of questions in the questions and answers there about capacity, but capacity must be developed in line with demand. And what we're seeing is the costs that are increasing for charges in the coming years are not in relation to the same level of increase in units, as in increase in traffic. So we need to work together to find a solution on this. There's no doubt about that. But we implore the European member states who have the power in their hand to make the change to perhaps relax their views on the Single European Sky revision a little bit. The Single European Sky regulatory framework is the key to unlocking all of this. RP4 will come out of that Single European Sky framework. And at the moment, as I've already touched upon, it's the states who have the power in their hands, and the Parliament. And between us, we need to find a solution that moves aviation forwards and not backwards. Otherwise, we won't have a system and we won't have any sustainability.
Okay, thanks, Rory. So I suppose the main takeaway for me for this is we agree that we need to work collaboratively together for this. I think aviation in particular needs to have a story about how it's going to do this, and that involves all of the stakeholders participating in that. So I think RP4 will be a very interesting discussion, but I think we need to have that discussion sooner in terms of a roadmap of where we're going. So at this stage, it only remains for me, first of all, to thank the panelists for a very engaging conversation. It was really enthusiastic. We only barely touched on some of the issues that I would have liked to have got into in more depth. But again, I think I just want to reiterate my thanks for that, for all of the contributions. So again, thank you very much. So can you stay, just want to get a little plug in to stay tuned for our next webinar, where we talk about one of the issues we touched on there, which was the harmonised with the military and a harmonised military flight plan for Europe, because I strongly believe that greater integration with the military is critical, particularly in the European context, for doing that. We're also in the process of actually preparing a think paper to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Central Route Charges Office. And we have a little bit more detail in terms of some of the issues we touched on today. And so watch out for that this week. We will get that. So it only remains for me again just to say thanks to all the panelists and participants. And if you do have any other questions which we haven't addressed, please continue to send them in, and we will pass them on to the panelists to some particular issue you'd like to discuss. And apologies to anyone if I didn't get around to asking your question. So on behalf of Eurocontrol, I'd just like to say thanks again. Look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.